Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, David Kaye, clinical professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, who from 2014 to 2020 was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. He's the author of Speech Police, The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet, and his work addresses, among other topics, the ways in which artificial intelligence technologies implicate human rights issues, the global private surveillance industry and its impact on freedom of expression, and growing repression of freedom of expression globally. Welcome to Background Briefing, David Kaye.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And what seems to be going on now, particularly in Russia, where the Russian state media is ubiquitous, and in fact, as far as I can tell, what's happening in Russia is similar to what happened here in the United States with that early euphoria over the shock and awe of great victory in Iraq, which later turned sour. But at the time of the toppling of Saddam's statue, most of the American media and the most American people were cheering on the war, and it seems to be a similar situation now in Russia. And now that we've had these reports of these atrocities in the outskirts of Kyiv, the propagandists are working overtime. So it's not a question of free speech so much as propaganda. So how do you deal with propaganda in terms of what legal ramifications there are? Is there any kind of, it's not in the laws of war so much, but in a way, as much as you want to put Putin on trial, I think you also really need to put Putin's propagandists on trial, do you not?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, although, I would say that there are some pretty significant differences between, the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the current situation. Although, that the U.S. invasion was also kind of whipped up by lies and disinformation around weapons of mass destruction and so forth. And then afterwards, as you note, there was a kind of a cheerleading section in the media for the U.S. action. But I think that the difference that we're seeing right now, at least within Russia itself, is that Russia has imposed a kind of draconian censorship that, in Russia hasn't been seen since the Soviet era, even, not even in the 80s, in the time of glasnost and perestroika. I mean, this is some very, very serious clamping down on independent media. Even the use of the term war can lead one to be prosecuted and arrested and then prosecuted by the government. And what you have are kind of two things at the same time. On the one hand, you have the government criminalizing independent reporting, and you have the government filling the resulting space with propaganda. And that of course leads to a place where, the viewing audience, the citizens of Russia are only getting one story, and the story they're getting is also full of lies. I mean, they're told that the massacres in Ukraine, for example, were either set up by crisis actors or, they were committed by Ukraine itself. So there's, it's a combination of censorship and propaganda is not per se illegal under international law. And so there are a lot of kind of complications as to how we address it, but it's particularly hard in an environment like Russia where, there's the criminalization on the one hand and the disinformation on the other.
Well, at this point, Ukrainian authorities are investigating almost 4,500 alleged Russian war crimes. So the weight of evidence is growing all the time. And I guess if we're learning so much horror happened just in the areas around Kyiv that were where the Russians evacuated, imagine what's going on in the rest of the country.
It's really frightening. And people shouldn't be under the impression that because the Russian army has moved away from Kyiv, that it's over. I mean, there's continuing shelling and almost certainly war crimes taking place across the country. And so, Yeah, we're in a situation where, there are a variety of international mechanisms that are being set up to approach the problem of holding Russians accountable for all of these crimes, but there's no mechanism right now to actually stop it other than Ukrainian resistance on the ground.
So one of the more alarming things that's happening in the Russian media now is that initially, of course, the propaganda said that we had to go in to liberate the Ukrainian people from the Nazi government, that we had to denazify the country. And this case was made that even though Zelensky is Jewish, that the government in Kyiv were Nazis. They didn't really blame the people so much as the government. But now it's extending beyond the government. They're effectively, the Russian propagandists now are blaming the people, and that's their response to the resistance that the Ukrainian army has shown. So now the propagandists are saying that because we haven't conquered the place yet and they're resisting, that means that the entire population are a bunch of Nazis. I mean, this starts to take you into the territory of genocide, does it not?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, the entire narrative that's being constructed out of Moscow is, of real grave concern. I mean, when you think back to the argument that Putin made, although it's less an argument than just kind of a set of disinformation narratives that he made at the beginning, was Russia and Ukraine are actually one people. Ukraine doesn't exist as a country and all of this. And, look what's happening now. Ukrainians are resisting. They're sort of, the attack has in many ways reinforced their national identity. And that makes all of these, sort of moves by the Russian army to both target civilians, not just in the sense of dropping bombs on particular, housing blocks and so forth, but of actually murdering people, essentially executing individuals on the street. And we've seen so many of these terrible images over the last several days. But yeah, I mean, it is looking more and more like targeting a particular nation as opposed to a kind of generic civilian population. And it's really quite frightening and really devastating to thousands and upon thousands, if not hundreds of thousands and millions of lives in Ukraine.
And again, I'm speaking with David Kaye, who's a clinical professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, who from 2014 to 2020 was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. He's the author of Speech Police, The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet, and his work addresses, among other topics, the ways in which artificial intelligence technologies implicate human rights issues, the global private surveillance industry and its impact on freedom of expression, and growing repression of freedom of expression globally. So just to provide some context of what we're just talking about, the possibility now that Russian propaganda is now suggesting that it's not just the government of Ukraine that are Nazis, it's the whole country are Nazis and they have to be purged, and it'll be a long war. And we're heading into the kind of notion of genocide, which is what the President Zelensky has accused the Russians of being intent on. An op-ed was published Sunday in the Russian state outlet Rai Novotsky by Timofey Sergetsev, and it basically makes the entire Ukrainian population complicit in Nazism. And he's calling for a generation-long occupation of the country and the liquidation of the Ukrainian state and its political elites, and consigning them all to forced labor for any accomplices of the Kyiv regime. And just to quote the article, denazification is necessary when a significant part of the people, most likely the majority, have been mastered and drawn into the Nazi regime in its politics. That is when the hypothesis, the people are good, the government is bad, does not work. And then in an interview with the New Statesman, an influential Russian political theorist, Sergei Karaganov, argued that the conflict in Ukraine was now existential for Russia, as it is a proxy war with the entirety of the West, and Russia cannot afford to lose. So we'll need a kind of victory. And if there is a sense that we are losing the war, then I think there is a definite possibility of escalation. So this is getting darker and darker, is it not, David?
It absolutely is. I mean, I'm not sure I have much to add in terms of just the darkness that you just described. In part because I'm not a Russia or Ukraine expert in particular, but I would say that this whole idea of articulating the situation in the country and articulating the aims of the government of Russia around essentially claiming any kind of victory that they can, because I read that interview in the New Statesman as well, and it was really shocking in its basic premise that the Russians need a victory of some sort, whatever that might be. And it is an entire narrative around the importance of a unique and uniquely powerful Russia, around sort of the idea of the West being an enemy and that Ukraine had been a part of that kind of aggressive attitude toward Russia. They're creating this entire narrative that also feeds into and informs the propaganda that we're seeing across Russia, within Russia. And you see that, they're trying to bring that propaganda outside the country as well, although it's a little bit harder for them to do right now, given the restrictions on state media outside of Russia right now. But I think all of these things are put together, are working together in tandem. These very kind of martial statements by Russian leaders and thinkers, and the resulting propaganda that comes from it. These are all working in a similar direction.
So just in the last couple of minutes then, let's talk about the use of the internet, or the clamping down on the internet in Russia, to the point where only, as you mentioned earlier, if you use the word war, you can be arrested and get 15 years in jail. Is there anything that can be done to penetrate that wall?
Well, it's a good question. My understanding is that YouTube is still available. So there's at least some access for people, although that can be very risky because as popular as YouTube is, Russia has a very sophisticated surveillance network. And, people who are using these kinds of tools are often taking a certain kind of risk in, being identified as somebody who's trying to learn the truth about what's happening in Ukraine. But apart from that, this very, very deep censorship makes it very difficult for people to get outside information. The one possibility that they've had, or that many have had for some time, is the use of VPNs, virtual private networks, that are basically apps on your devices that allow you to circumvent the restrictions and get access to web servers that are hosted outside of Russia. And, there's been a real crackdown by the government on the use of VPNs. So there's just a kind of a full offensive against truthful information and independent reporting in Russia. And that's making it extremely hard for people to get real information. And, the other point to say is that, with the extent of the propaganda in the country, there are a lot of people who aren't looking for different sources of information. And, that's what propaganda is designed to do as well, to basically tamp down even your curiosity in learning the truth.
Well, David Kaye, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks so much, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with David Kaye, who's a clinical professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, who from 2014 to 2020 was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. He's the author of Speech Police, The Global Struggle to Govern the Internet, and his work addresses, among other topics, the ways in which artificial intelligence technologies implicate human rights issues, the global private surveillance industry, and its impact on freedom of expression and growing repression of freedom of expression